Not far away, let's talk story. It's where my mama was born, it's where I come from, it's where my daddy fell in love not long ago.
Aloha everyone, this is Larry Camp, and welcome to the Nobody Knows Your Story podcast, which just happens to come with a side of Hawaiiana. Nobody Knows Your Story is a podcast which I believe will impact each listener in a positive way. As you listen to the experiences that have transformed, shaped, and guided each guest, perhaps you'll better understand your own personal journey. Some will surprise, some will make you question, and some will inspire, but all will leave you in a better place for listening in. As for the Hawaiiana, well, that's just a big part of my life story. So I invite you to check in from time to time, or better still, add Nobody Knows Your Story to your list of favorite podcasts. You'll enjoy hearing the life experiences of people just like you.
Stay up late and rise up early too with the morning dew. The sun is shining, so I'm on my way trying to find something new. Even when I'm lost, I'm knowing right where I'm going. Well, life's an ocean of emotions, and I'm just floating. Cause I'm in that deep water, and I gotta get away. Cause you know I'm in that deep, deep water, searching out for my getaway. Yes, I'm in that deep water, and I gotta get away. Cause you know I'm in that deep water, searching out for my getaway. Ocean of emotions, better learn to swim. Got too many of them, gonna fall victim. Good riddance, cause you know it's all fun and games and fun until the other fun and grow. The world's going down, so I learn to fly. They don't appreciate the life till it's time to die. Really wonder why we even try. For the pain, for the love, or just for the high. Cause I'm in that deep water, and I gotta get away. Cause you know I'm in that deep, deep water, searching out for my getaway. Yes, I'm in that deep water, and I gotta get away. Cause you know I'm in that deep, deep water, searching out for my getaway.
Aloha everyone. Today, as you might have guessed, we're going to hear a very interesting and unique life story. Thank you all for being here because you're going to be affected positively for listening in. Now, we just heard Landon McNamara with a favorite of mine called Deep Water. Mid-podcast, well, we're going to hear a favorite of my guest today as he requested this song, Esale Lia, performed by Fiji. And I've enjoyed Fiji's music for many years, all the way back to when he was playing with the Hawaiian-style band. Now, Joe Elder grew up in the West. Started in the southwest, I guess, of Texas, and then ended up in the Mountain West in Wyoming and Utah. Joe was into movies, church, reading, music, and sports. Now, that sounds fairly typical, right? But we're about to hear why things aren't always as they appear. Joe, welcome to Nobody Knows Your Story.
Larry, thank you. To start out with, when I was born, I was born with a liver condition, and my liver wasn't working correctly, and I nearly died. That's pretty much how the story starts. From there, obviously, there was a return to health, and then I grew up in San Antonio, Brownwood, all over typically the Dallas-Fort Worth area as an infant and as a child. And then a little later on, we moved all over the place in those areas, and then we moved just outside of Austin, Texas, to my family's homestead out there in Spicewood, Texas.
You were moving because your dad was changing jobs or doing things, or
Yeah.
maybe his job was transfer him to different locations. Is that what it was?
we jokingly referred to it as like the every year and a half itch. My dad was he was a physical therapist. He was also a hospital administrator. He pretty much did a whole host of things when we were growing up. He taught physical therapy at a Texas Women's University out there in Dallas. And then from there, he actually just worked in hospital administration. We were bouncing all over the place. And to the credit of my mom, she just kind of held the family together. And my dad was just like going all over the place because he could. But as a family, when we moved to Spicewood, my grandmother and my grandfather, they primarily had their residence there, and we lived in a little trailer on their property because my dad's last job kind of fell through, and we stayed there for about 6 to 8 months. And then he got a job working as assistant hospital administrator in Rock Springs, Wyoming, and then we moved to Rock Springs. I didn't really like that experience. In fact, growing up in Texas, I loved Texas. The weather was awesome. I was very, very accustomed to very warm weather and nothing really extreme or cold. But when we moved to Wyoming, oh my gosh, the winter just about killed me.
Not only did you move to Wyoming, you moved to Rock Springs, Wyoming. And
Yeah.
and my nephew is actually my niece and her husband. So nephew by marriage, I guess. He manages Home Depot there. And let me tell you, that is a windy, cold place.
Yeah. I mean, my experience in Rock Springs alone, I will never live in Wyoming again because of that experience. It was miserable because when you say windy, you are absolutely right. I mean, it blows and blows and blows and just doesn't stop.
So would you have been like 10 years old then or something?
Yeah, I was 9 through 10, roughly. We lived there about a year and a half. I got there just as I was turning 9. And then we stayed through about 10 and a half. And then this was back in 1979 when all of the energy stuff was actually going on during the Carter administration. And they had a lot of coal mines in that area. But it was a rough town back in the day. You know,
Okay.
and
did you have siblings as well, Joe?
So I've got an older brother and 2 younger sisters. My brother was born in Provo, and I and my siblings were all born in Texas.
Okay. And then you guys all moved together. So mom, dad, and the 4 kids to Wyoming.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, so I think the experience was probably I think my siblings would actually say the same thing I told you, is like it was a miserable experience, because it was. And then from there, what was really interesting is my dad got a job as the hospital administrator in Nephi, Utah. Like, I was used to like really big cities, and Rock Springs wasn't a big city. And then Nephi I felt Nephi was even smaller than Rock Springs, but it was a lot more temperate. The people were a lot more friendly. I was raised in the LDS church, so it was like it.
So let me stop you there for a second, Joe.
Yeah.
The LDS Church, for people listening that don't know, that stands for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, sometimes referred to as Mormons. So if we use the acronym LDS, that's what Joe's talking about.
Thank you.
Yep.
So what was really interesting is that my experience coming to Utah was quite different than the experience that I had in Texas related to the church. I guess the best way to explain it is outside of Utah, it's much more consistent with coming together and feeling like a true church family. And my experience in Utah hasn't been quite that homogenous, I guess, would be the best way to say it. So
I've got to interject another thought here, because, you and I just met each other like, what, half an hour ago?
Yeah.
And it's so funny because so much of what you're saying I can relate to, because I too was born into the LDS community.
Yeah.
I grew up outside of Utah.
Uh-huh.
And I just told this story within the last 3 days. I was with a group of people, and we were talking about this very thing. And I said, when I lived in San Diego, there were so few Mormons that I felt like I needed to be a really good example for all the people that didn't know Mormons. I may be the only Mormon they've ever known. So I felt like it was really a calling almost to try to be a good example and do the right things. And I was young. I mean, I was like junior high or whatever. And then I moved to Utah. And so I know exactly what you're talking about, because it's very different. All of a sudden, my neighbors are Mormons. The people across the street are Mormon. I mean, everybody was Mormon pretty much. Yeah. I mean, in my high school, if I had to guess, I would guess that 93% were Mormon, probably back in the 70s.
Oh, sure.
It's changed a little now. There's, there's more diversity certainly in Salt Lake City, which is where I went to high school. But
Right.
so I didn't want to interrupt you there, but I just really felt like, dude, we got a lot in common.
Oh yeah, man. That experience for me was, it started me on a course of like really kind of looking at things as they are, not as I wanted them to be. Actually, what was really interesting is a lot of my friends growing up in Utah were not LDS. And I think a big part of that had to do with the fact that both my parents were converts to the church. They joined when they were like just, I think my mom joined at 16 and my father joined after he got out of the Navy in his 20s. What was really interesting to me was that a lot of my extended family weren't LDS, and I loved them. One thing I always struggled with was this identity of like, okay, we've got the truth and the whole truth and nothing but the truth. I'm like, okay, well, what about my family in Texas? What about the ones that are like Catholic or Christian and aren't doing the LDS thing? I never really truly got a good vibe from that. I love these people. I wasn't going to just say, okay, I've got the truth. But what was really interesting is that I felt more uniquely connected to those that weren't LDS than those that were. I can't say I didn't have LDS friends, because I did, and a lot of them were wonderful, but I just felt more connected to those that weren't, because a lot of the experiences I had, they were ostracized or they weren't embraced. Mm-hmm. And then that comes to another thing. So we didn't live in Nephi that long, and my dad then moved us to American Fork, and he opened up a private practice doing physical therapy, and he did that for a bit, and then that didn't really kind of pan out, and then he started working at the Utah State Hospital for those that had severe handicaps and issues related to mental deficiencies. That's where he primarily worked. So when we got there, I literally went from middle school in Nephi to going back to elementary school, and man, that didn't fly with me very well. So I was kind of bummed out. I struggled with kind of accommodating a lot of the changes that had taken place from Texas to Wyoming to Utah. I got depressed. Within a short amount of time, things in American Fork, my mom finally just put her foot down and said, we're not going to move again until all the kids are done with basically high school. I got done with elementary school. I did junior high and high school in American Fork. Towards my junior year, I started getting the questions of, are you going on a mission? And I was like, absolutely not. I'm going to go into the military, and this is what I'm going to do. I didn't have any particular driving desire to really go. My brother went. The family kind of expected me that I was going to jump on board, and I'm like, absolutely not. So my mom, knowing kind of where I was at mentally, she kept bringing over the missionaries, and we'd have dinner, and I'd get to know them. And, a few of them had some really wild stories, and I really appreciated that. I was like, okay, these guys are just kind of down to earth, real human beings, and that's okay.
Yeah, and it kind of normalized them to you, and could say, and so you could see, hey, these are regular guys.
Yeah.
So, and that was smart of your mom.
Right. Well, the next part's actually brilliant. So then she actually brought my best friend Brett over. So Brett gets to know him, and he likes him, and then we start having the missionary discussions. Half of them at my house, I think, a few over at his house, and he decides to get baptized. But he said, I'm not getting baptized unless Joe baptizes me. And I'm like, what? I just didn't see that coming at all. So I was just like, okay, right there, course correct. We were in our senior year. We were probably 2 or 3 months away from graduation. He gets baptized by me. And I'm like sitting there going, you know what? That was kind of a neat experience. I might want to consider actually looking and doing that. So instead of actually joining one of the branches, I put my paperwork in. I moved to Texas. I spent the summer with my grandparents, got my mission call when I was down there, and I got a call to the Illinois Peoria mission. If nobody really knows, two of the biggest church historical sites are found in that mission, Nauvoo and Carthage jail. Now, Nauvoo and Carthage were the place where Joseph Smith moved out after the Missouri experience and created the biggest town in the state, bigger even than Chicago at the time. And then he was subsequently martyred a few years later in Carthage jail, which is about 20 or 30 miles from where Nauvoo's at. So
Did you serve in either of those areas as a missionary?
yeah, I served 6 months of my mission. I actually spent in Nauvoo Ward. That right there is part of kind of the story where things start really kind of evolving at that point for me spiritually. I started feeling like that I was getting watched. I don't know how to really describe that, but I was in Nauvoo Ward. I lived in a town called Keokuk that's down the Mississippi about 16 miles and across it. What was really interesting about that is a short time, I'd been somewhat successful, but I'd been burned out by this time. I'd been asked to retrain a fairly new missionary that had some fairly bad experiences with his trainer and didn't really get into the work or hadn't been as proficient in it as the mission president wanted. And I'd been asked to retrain him. So I'm like, okay. I had just had a terrible experience with this missionary that just didn't have any desire to be there, and he was just doing time. And that was a struggle for me because for me, I mean, I was dedicated. I mean, I was there doing it, believing I was serving God, and that's what for me really was the burning desire. At some point, I had determined I was done. I was gonna get a bus ticket, and I was going home, and I was like, I mapped this out in my head. I'm like, I don't care what the stake president says. I don't care what the bishop says. I'm done. I'm so done with all of this BS. But I was still dealing with this concept that I felt like there was eyes watching me, and it was weird. So I had probably one of the most profound spiritual experiences on my mission. It changed everything. I had the experience literally where I found out that God knew who I was. I wasn't some one of 7 billion people on the planet. I mean, he knew me better than I knew myself. It changed the course and trajectory of kind of what I planned. I rededicated myself, completed my mission, and then within that time frame, my dad had moved the family from American Fork to Texas, back to American Fork, and then to St. George. And I'd never lived in St. George, so I flew to St. George, got off the plane, and experienced what Jay Golden Kimball had described as hell. I mean, the heat in August back in 1990. I mean, I think it was 115 degrees outside, and all the moisture in my lungs just got sucked out the minute I stepped into the light.
It's a dry heat.
Oh my gosh. I'd never experienced anything that severe. I mean, in Texas, it's hot and humid, but the humidity stays with you. It's like in this experience, it's like the humidity inside of me just got sucked out of me. And I was just like, I was not prepared for that.
And I'm guessing you didn't stay long.
Actually, you know what? I stayed down there 16 years.
My goodness.
One thing that was fascinating is I lived. Now, it wasn't all in one setting. It was 10 years and then like 6 years and then back. So basically what's really interesting about that is my family took me to Zion's National Park, and talk about another spiritual experience. I mean, taking a look at like 3,000, 2,000, 3,000 foot sandstone cliffs in a valley with a beautiful river meandering through it. And I mean, I just fell in love with that area. I started school at Dixie College, which is now I believe it's Dixie Technical College now.
Utah Technical College.
Oh, Utah Technical College. They changed the name, I don't know, 2 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, I worked until I had about 3 credits to go to get my associate's degree, and then I was going to go to another school, but I got a job offer working at Aola Products, which is a Polynesian-run family company. At the time, they were into weight loss and dietary supplements and all sorts of stuff, and it was a burgeoning, growing company. And yeah, I got in there right when they needed a lot of help, and so I was primarily working in their shipping department, and it just kept growing and growing and growing. But I got disillusioned probably 3 years into it. I saw I wasn't really going anywhere, and I didn't like some things that were going on in the company. With that, I just determined that it was time to leave. So I left, and I went back to school. And this is where another really significant event started happening. So I was about 25 at this point in time. I hadn't done the traditional, like, get off the mission, go and get married, and all this other stuff. I really was trying to find something that would settle me, but I had this unbelievable anxiety every time I started thinking about or even contemplating marriage. But I also didn't have a lot of good examples. I had a friend that was a professional boxer. There were several times I got calls like 6 o'clock in the morning, he's going to kill me, and then hang up. I got a couple of those, and I'd run over the house, and they'd be just not very nice to each other, and they had a lot of kids, and like helping them deal with that. And then I had some issues with my brother too, and just his marriage to his wife, who recently passed. But I was still dedicated to the church. And one of the things that actually happened is I left the college wards because I was burned out on it was just like a dating mill, but I didn't find really any spiritual feast in that. So I went to a family ward and got called to be a home teacher. One of the people I actually got called to home teach was actually a young lady close to my age. Her name was Michelle Orange. I was in school. I was going through a scuba class. I told her about it, and she went scuba diving with her fiance and died that night. I don't understand exactly what happened, but apparently she went down with him. This was a night dive, and then he lost track of her, and they were looking for her for over a week, and she had promised to call me after she got back. So I kept calling her voicemail, which we didn't have cell phones at the time, but I was just calling and leaving messages on her machine. And what was really weird about this is I got home from school one day, and my dad's like, "Hey, I'm really sorry about your friend." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I had never introduced my dad to her. So I'm reading in the paper, and he's like, "It's in the obituary." I turned to it, and like, sure enough, she's right there, and her funeral's the very next day. I never got an opportunity to just tell her really how I felt about it. And this is like a real critical part for me, because at this stage in my life, I'd been kind of thinking everything was like I was invincible. I was Superman. Nothing was really affecting me or touching me physically. But I was in a point where I didn't understand how vulnerable I was to loss. When I went to her funeral, it was almost as if she had set things up to say, "I want you there." One of the women that was a hairstylist that worked under her, because she managed a hairstylist salon, we went together to her funeral. What was really interesting is that she'd been somewhat inactive when I became her home teacher, and then she got reactivated and gone through the temple. I felt that there were some really good experiences that I'd had to help her do that, but I didn't take accountability for that. I just said I was just doing home teaching. So I go to the funeral, and her fiance and her family, they just thanked me for kind of what service I had been involved in. But it left an impression that's never left me. And the impression that I got from that experience was to never, ever leave a conversation with somebody that you care about without telling them that you love them, because you never know if that's going to be your last one or not. And I had never experienced that, but when I experienced it with Michelle, it changed something in me. And every time I typically have a conversation with a family member or a friend of mine, I always leave now making sure that I say the words "I love you," because, I don't want it to ever seem like or feel like there's bad blood, even if it's an argument. And I've had plenty of them with family members and friends. I always take time to actually make sure that before I leave, I let them know that I love them, because of that experience. It affected me.
When you lose somebody, it changes you. There's no doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, and I
Yeah.
think that's my takeaway from what you're telling me here, is that had a real profound effect on you. It's continued all these years, because that was like, what, 20, 30 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So from there, basically, I moved up to Cedar City from St. George, started working on finishing a bachelor's degree, and decided that I was going to go into psychology. That's another interesting thing. I'd already kind of knew what I was probably destined to do from the time I was about 13 or 14. I just had this ability to talk to people and have them share their stories, their hopes, their dreams, like everything. That had been kind of like a very interesting experience that I've had my entire life. So in high school, there was a teacher by the name of Mr. Wagstaff in American Fork. He taught psychology, and it was an abnormal psychology class, and I just ate it up my junior year. And then I became his teacher's aide my senior year. At some point, I like when I was on my mission, I was like, I'm probably going to go into psychology. I just don't know what I'm going to do. But with going into business, And then leaving, I was just like, okay, I'm going to go back. I'm going to finish and I'm going to go into psychology. So I didn't know what my minor was going to be. So I tried education and that didn't work for me. So then I finished up with a major in psychology and a minor in history. A short time after that, I met my future wife. We dated probably four months and got married, but it wasn't in the LDS temple. We ran to Vegas and we eloped because I just been fairly, inappropriate, let's just say, with boundaries and stuff like that. We determined to get married in Vegas, and we eloped, and that was a shock to her family. It was a shock to my family, but we all kind of made it work. And then a short time after that, found out we were pregnant. He was still going through school, and I was commuting from Cedar City to Colorado City because we were doing this pilot program. My dad and I were in business, and we were doing EEG biofeedback training, which is like are you either up training or down training brain waves. And when you do that, you get changes of behavior. Now, all the kids that we were working with were identified as potential dropouts. And every one of the kids changed their grades from D's and F's to C's. And there was a few of them that literally got on the honor roll. And the only thing that changed was the EEG biofeedback. And there were reports of like a lot of the kids changing and being more emotionally available and honest with their family members. I mean, it was a dramatic shift, nothing that I'd ever really seen before. And then that didn't really work out. And then a short time later, about a year into our marriage, our son by that time came, and then we moved to St. George and moved back to Cedar to support her to finish school. But she'd had enough at that point. I think a big part of this and the realization that I had is that my anxiety when I was in a relationship is just it just absolutely paralyzes me. I guess is the best way to say it, because I take on all the thoughts of the financial responsibility and I start thinking about it incessantly, and I can't turn my head off. I wasn't the most attentive husband. I'll just put it that way. I wasn't the most kind or loving. I was very traumatized by the experiences that I was having internally, but I never talk about it. I try to just have the mindset of like manning myself through it, but it wasn't working. And we went to counseling, and that really wasn't working. And eventually the counselor who I trusted finally just said, I think she's done. Within a short amount of time, we started the divorce process. That was just an extensive long-term issue. Going through my first divorce was more traumatic and hard on me than anything I had ever been through. But for 2 years, we fought over basically custody issues, and she didn't want me to have custody. And I was not going to just let my son not know who I was and just throw my hands up in the air. So for 2 years, we just had this ugly ongoing battle. And during it, the best way for me to explain it is we talk about the idea of having a broken heart, but I literally felt like I had a broken heart. I mean, I went to it felt like my heart had rent and there was a gash inside my heart. I went to my LDS bishop. I went to my dad. I had all these priesthood blessings. Nothing fixed it. I mean, nothing. And this is where another big transformation came. So about a year and a half into all of this, I started dating, and my bishop told me not to. And I was just like, screw you, I'm going to do it anyway. We got close, the woman and I that were dating one another, and we had sex, and I told on myself, and I got excommunicated. That wasn't a pleasant experience, but it was necessary the way I felt about it. I turned myself in. I wasn't gonna hide from it. I wasn't gonna try to justify it. I wasn't trying to rationalize it. I just said, this is where it's at. So I got excommunicated. And what was really interesting about that is I had another spiritual experience where I was basically told I was going to be okay. And this is something that was necessary. And I was like, okay. And then within about a few months after that, I started drinking. This is another transformational experience that I had. I started drinking, and I was like, instantaneously, I was like, where has my best friend been my entire life? Why have I never experienced this before? And within a week, I was drinking at 7 o'clock in the morning, and I was just off to the races. It was ugly.
Now, had you ever drank alcohol or anything like during high school or anything at all?
No, I mean, by this time I'm about 30 years old. I'd never touched any alcohol. I'd lived the LDS standards of like abstaining from any drugs or alcohol. I'd adhered to that perfectly. But in this particular experience, the only thing I was seeking, I was filled with so much hate and anger and just rage at myself and just the circumstances I found myself in, that the only thing I wanted was escape. I didn't want to feel any of that. It was painful. And the only thing I wanted is not to feel. And the only thing I knew from my experience growing up is drugs and alcohol are a very convenient way of like helping you do that. Because I had some cousins that were my parents' age, actually, that I didn't see those guys ever not have a beer in their hand, whether or not they were driving cars or not. It was unbelievable how persistent that stuff was in my family back in Texas. So I grew up knowing that it had a numbing agent, especially for my cousins that came back from Vietnam. And I was just like, okay, I started drinking. I mean, the minute I started, I was done. I don't know how to describe it any other way other than I had the alcoholic gene and it caught me, and I'd been warned about it. But at this point in time, I just didn't care.
So you talked about your family, your cousins always having a beer. When you say you have the alcoholic gene, what you mean by that is people in your family had told you that there's family members who have struggled with alcohol.
Well, not only struggled, but the stories I was told is both my grandfathers on my mom's and my dad's side died from cirrhosis of the liver, which means they drank themselves to death. Mm-hmm. Okay. And then I had on my grandmother's side, all of her brothers were fairly heavy drinkers. It came to light a little while later that my grandmother's dad was a pretty significant alcoholic, but he'd also gotten a gunfight with a guy that was hitting on his wife, killing him. That just changed the whole course of everything. And that hadn't been something that I'd really known until I was like 35, maybe.
But you knew about the drinking issues, though, with your grandparents and stuff. So maybe in a way, that's what kept you from drinking. I mean, of course, it's against the rules, but I'm just saying maybe anytime you thought about it, you thought, hey, I can't do that because of the history in my family.
No, exactly. And I also wanted to be a straight-laced, good LDS Mormon. But by this time, I'd been excommunicated. I was also, I had a I don't care attitude. I was filled with pain. I was filled with anger. I was filled with just rage. And I was just like, I just wanted it all to go away. I didn't want to experience anymore.
Sure.
So I'm sitting there, and alcohol's not working. The problem I was having is like, there's an unbelievable amount of tolerance that runs in my family, and I could drink and drink and drink, and it wouldn't affect me. It became a significant enough problem that my roommate, who's actually a sheriff's deputy for Washington County, told me at the time, he's like, you're drinking way too much. I don't know how you handle this, but you might want to really look at it. And he'd said that to me a couple of times, but it didn't really register. A short time before I stopped drinking, another significant event occurred. I was going to some type of workshop related to this stuff called remote viewing, which is it's a consciousness thing where you split your consciousness out of your body and you can go and view things in time and space. And I was totally into it back in the day, but there's a woman that just came up to me and she said, your aura is really off. There's something wrong. I just got the impression, go with it, tell her whatever. So I told her everything. I told her about being excommunicated. I told her about being LDS. I told her about losing my faith. I told her about losing myself. And I told her about this divorce and how I just felt like, because I was dealing with it, I just didn't feel like existence had anything more to give me. And I felt like I lost everything that meant anything of value to me. And I said, honestly, I've been for about a year and a half, I've been feeling like my heart's just rent in two, and I don't have any way of healing it. I've gone to bishops, I've gone to my dad for priesthood blessings, and nothing's happened. And she's like, okay. And then she's like, I'm a spiritual healer. I'm going to take just a minute and I'm going to do something to you. And like, the best way for me to explain it is like, I am Mr. Skeptical when it comes to anything like energy healing, spiritual healing. I'm like, no, the priesthood's the only way, right? I mean, this is what I've been led to believe. Mm-hmm. She puts her hand on my back. She starts waving the other hand over my heart area. And it literally feels like the hand that she put on my back is just a hot poker, like it's going to burn itself all the way through my back. It was that hot. I'd never experienced anything like that. I yelled. I was like, oh my gosh. And she's like, just sit with it. Just sit with it. And by the time she got done, she said, okay, tell me what you're feeling now. This is where my mind just absolutely fragmented into like a million pieces, because it's like, here it was, okay, it was a woman, not a man. It wasn't the priesthood. It had nothing to do with the church. And I am healed, and I have no way of explaining this other than to just have my mind blown and just look at her and thank her. I've never seen her since. It was just a random encounter. And I'm like sitting there going, okay, I've got to reevaluate this whole thing called healing and what it means, because this had nothing to do with what I believed was going to heal me, which was like the spiritual process of the power of the LDS priesthood. But I was no longer a member of the church, and this happened. And I mean, my mind is just fragmented in like a million different pieces. And I'm like going, but what's going on? So a short time after this, and mind you, I wasn't in the best mental health issue either. I was working 3 jobs. I was getting very little sleep. I was filled with anger and rage at what was going on legally, and what they were saying about me related to wanting to take my son, never let me have any custodial visits. And they couldn't do that, but they said enough stuff in the legal paperwork where it felt like it was going to happen. And it was devastating, because I wanted to be a dad, and I wanted to be a part of my son's life. And it got to the point where there wasn't a night or day for that entire 2 years that I was going through that divorce that I didn't think of homicide, and I didn't think of suicide. And it got to a point where I just determined, well, if this doesn't end, I'm definitely not going to kill somebody, but I am going to take my own life, because that's more responsible than taking somebody else out, because I didn't want to just take one person out. I wanted to take several people out. But what was really interesting is what happened. Is like, I don't think there was a night or a day that I didn't pray to God to say, dude, just take this from me. And it would never be taken from me. And I determined that I was gonna visit with my son. I was gonna take him to his mom, drop him off, and then I was gonna go out to the West Desert and just end the existence and the pain that I was in, because it wasn't helping me, and it wasn't gonna help my son, and it wasn't gonna help her. And it wasn't going to help my family. I was just that compromised. So
But you also mentioned that in high school you'd had a little depression.
Yeah.
And you know enough about alcohol. What does that do?
That can depressant, man. It just puts me into the seed of like, I mean, this is an all night experience for me. I'm drinking just trying to get to sleep. I'm drinking trying to escape, and nothing's touching it. And I'm getting further and further into that dark abyss called just alcoholism. And at that point, I didn't think I had a problem. I just thought, you know what? I'm just trying to escape from all this pain, and it's not touching it. That just means I got to drink more. And I did. So I'm depressed. I'm anxious. I'm filled with rage. I have no outlet. Yeah, I've made a plan, and I'm going to go execute myself. I see my son. I pick him up for that weekend, the last weekend I'm going to have with him, and I'm a responsible parent. I put him down for a nap at some point in the early to late morning, about 11 o'clock. He gets up from a nap, and this is the thing that was absolutely just another course correct. He comes to me. He's almost 2 years old. It's not quite 2, and he says this to me. It helps change everything for me at this point, but it's not going to change my drinking, because it's a problem by this point. So he's like, Dad, I've got a message for you. And I was enough attuned to like what goes on to know that, toddlers don't speak like that to an adult. So I'm like, well, okay, I better listen to this. But I've been drinking beer too. So I've got a nice little buzzing effect going on. So I put him on a bar stool next to me, and I'm like, okay, shoot, tell me what's going on. And he told me that Jesus came to him in his dream and to tell me that he loved me. So he tells me this, and I'm just like, you've got to be kidding me right now. I have to find out right now. And I've been like for almost the last 2 years pleading for something to reveal itself. I put my son on my lap. I just break down. I'm bawling like a kid. I mean, for like 20 minutes, I mean, the tears are coming down, the snot's coming out of my nose, and I'm just like, okay, it's time to reevaluate. Sunday comes along, he's picked up, he's taken back, and I've got to start assessing. Okay, well, what comes next? Because I'm still dealing with this. I'm still dealing with this anger. I'm still dealing with this rage. I'm still dealing with these thoughts. Nothing's changing it. By this time, I still don't believe alcohol is a problem. So a few months go by. My roommate informs me that he's moving to New York and he's going to leave. But before that, we basically invite some friends over, and we're having like a nice little get together, and it involves alcohol mainly. My roommate leaves to go on shift, and I've cooked and got everything ready, but I'm already drinking. I mean, heavily. I'm drinking hard alcohol, and I'm chasing it down with beer. He comes back from shift, and he's been gone for 13 hours. And then he comes in and gives me a field sobriety test, and I pass it. And he's like, dude, if you had been driving tonight, I'd be legally obligated to let you leave. Knowing that you drank this much, you might really need to look at that. And I didn't pay attention to that. I just said, well, I wanted to runs in my family. And I just chalked it up as like another one of those experiences I was having with my alcohol, but I was an alcoholic. I still couldn't see it. The next day he gets up and he's flicking the lights on and off, pounding on the pots and pans together. And I get up, I'm like, hey man, you're going to wake up the neighbors. It's way too early to do this. And he's like, don't you have any headache? And I'm like, oh, you want to know if I have a hangover? I've never had a hangover. And at that point, he warned me again. He's like, you really need to look at this. I wasn't in a space or capacity to even hear what he was saying, because for me, it was my everyday experience. So what's interesting is that night I went to the Walmart, and I went by the alcohol section to get some beer, and I had this experience where every cell of my body told me I had to have it, and I knew right then and there what that meant, because I'd seen it in my family. I was like, that meant I was an alcoholic, and that was unacceptable to me. I'd never experienced that, but like I don't know how to describe it other than to just say an experience like that will get you to drink again. There's no doubt about it. But at that point, I knew I needed to do something radically different. So I left the shopping cart, the food, and all that other stuff there, and I said some very true things out loud at the top of my lungs about being effed. And then I got my car. I went to my apartment. I got on my knees, and I made a covenant with God. I just said, look, I can't do this again. If this happens, I know what that means. That means I'm probably going to go about 2 more years. I'm going to get really sick. I'm going to have cirrhosis of the liver, and then I'm going to die. And I said, I don't want that. I want to raise my son. I want to have some purpose in my life. So I'll tell you what, this is what I will do. If you make it so that I don't have that experience again, I promise you that I'm going to help anybody and everybody that I ever come in contact with that has this problem, and I'll move heaven and earth to help get them whatever they need to get out of this problem.
Isa sombolei lia au na soko wa sayani ve iko isalei lia nanomulenga kosoma iwai senga nilo mata rawa mai Vuni nongo lenga andilia oile lia Isalei lia Isa sombolei lia au na soko wa sayani ve iko isalei lia au na soko wa sayani ve iko isalei
God has a sense of humor, at least when it comes to me, because of what was about to happen. So I was almost done with graduate school to get my degree in counseling psychology. Between the time I got my bachelor's degree and my master's degree, I went through working at a treatment center, and I couldn't do anything that I wanted to do that other people that had their master's degree were doing. So I got into graduate school. Mind you, I'd been drinking during the whole course of going through school, and then all of a sudden, this experience happens, and I've got about, 6 or 7 months left. And I was just like, okay. But what was really interesting is I never had that experience again. And because of that, I had some friends that were really good to me. I knew they loved me. I knew they supported me, but they drank just like I did. I couldn't stay in Southern Utah and continue that. So I packed everything up. I put my stuff in storage, and I moved up to Provo. I went about 6 months, just going off of the student loan stuff that I'd accumulated. And I was looking for work. I couldn't find anything because nobody was really hiring at the point. But I was looking to actually get a job in the psychology field, and nothing was really manifesting itself. So I'd get down to about $15 in my checking account. And by this time, again, I'm a big believer in God and prayer. I can't do this on my own. So I'm just like, okay, you've either got to show up or I've got to go somewhere else. So I got a job interview with New Skin to be a security guard, and they offered me the job. But just as they were offering me the job, that morning I got a phone call from this treatment center that was looking for a therapist. Well, looking for work, I should say. It was right in alignment with what I'd been studying. They offered me the job at New Skin, and I thanked them, and I told them, I said, but I've got another opportunity. It's right in alignment with what I've been studying in my master's degree to be a therapist, and I've got to find out what happens. And they were just awesome. They said, if it doesn't work out, let us know. You've got this job. I went and interviewed with the clinical director of this facility called Circle Lodge. I didn't know anything about it. We sat down for about 15 minutes. It was a good interview, but then she pulled me into the operations director's office, who I had met several months before and interviewed, and he told me I didn't have the credentials that they wanted, which were what my priorities were at the time was my son, education, and then it would be work, and he expected it to be flipped. So I go walking in his office with her, and I'm just like sitting there going, I don't think this is going to go very well. But then the owner is the one that actually came and met me, and he interviewed me for 15 minutes. And at the end of it, I'll never forget what happened. He stood up, he shook my hand, and he said, give him anything he wants. And he walked out of the room. I was so utterly humbled that that was just another mysterious God shot that I'd never experienced. And I didn't ask for anything other than $10 an hour and whatever they had. What was really interesting is they started me out as PRN, which meant that they would call me if they needed a shift covered, and that was it. That's all I got. I didn't ask to be a therapist. I didn't ask anything. I was just so humbled at that point. All I just wanted was a job where I could just go and do my work. What was interesting is they started me out at the bottom of the barrel, and I worked myself up within a very short amount of time, where I went from working frontline to then working during the day, then getting kind of an exclusive position of like helping all the new admits come in, and I would get them oriented. I'd get their medical stuff set up. I'd get their medical appointment set up. That was a coveted position, and people that had been there for 3 years, I literally, from the time I started until the time I got that position, it was probably less than 3 months. It was almost like I was fast tracked into this, and I didn't have any explanation for it because I didn't have an understanding of what I would just been given. This was to become one of the best treatment facilities in the country. It was like going to school all over again. I started meeting people from all over the world. I started meeting interventionists. I started meeting researchers. I started meeting fairly significant people in certain industries with entertainment and those other things that were involved in like the insurance of taking care of people that had problems in their respective fields, and they would send them to Cirque Lodge. I then got a counseling position after a counselor left, and then I very quickly actually eclipsed that to becoming the men's program director. And for 15 years, that's all I did. I ran the program. When the clinical director was gone, I ran that entire show. What happened is I started not only in my recovery, but also in the process of like learning and growing with the experiences I was having. I got to know the best minds in the business about how to actually work with addicts and alcoholics and how to get them from a state of like complete resistance to the message of recovery in the 12-step program to complete recovery, and how to do it with the least amount of problems and issues related to that. But there was work that was going to have to be involved in that. And it transformed everything. I very shortly thereafter had another experience. 14 years into this, my best friend, who was also a therapist that I'd also worked with to work there at Cirque Lodge, he had worked at Cirque Lodge and then left employment there. He and his wife were having some problems, and he was majorly depressed. He was having some very, very significant mental health issues. The only thing I really told him at the time is, dude, the only thing I want you to do is I want you to go to your therapist and I want you to get some help. And he was going to therapy, but one day he came home and he just said, it's all over. And I said, what do you mean by it's all over? And he's like, I think I'm going to lose my marriage. I think I'm going to lose my kids. And I think it's all over. And I said, well, you've got to give this some time. And I walked him through some scenarios that he and I were very well aware was going on in his life. We had a conversation just about this too shall pass. He agreed with what I was saying, and he went to bed. The next morning I got up and I had to go to work. And it was during this thing called Family Week, where all the families come, and for an entire week, all we do is programming to instruct them on the disease of addiction, the family system dynamics. They process with their loved ones about the problems associated with their alcoholism and how it's affected the families and them individually. And then we actually teach them about the aftercare program, about what they need to do to make the program work. The families are heavily involved in this. Those days are like 14, 15-hour days. I mean, they're not, and that occurs every 3 weeks. So I had another ex-client of mine call me and say, look, I've relapsed. I don't know what to do. And I said, look, let's meet for dinner. We'll get something set up. So I met him for dinner. We talked, and then I got some things set up for him to kind of get him back into treatment again. And then I go home, I find my best friend, and he's gone. I don't know exactly what happened. I just know he's gone. He's dead. I find him. I have to call the authorities. I have to give them the contact information for his wife and his kids, because he's got 6 kids, and I'm 44 at this time. I'm just devastated. And the thing that I'm devastated about isn't anything related to kind of, he's gone now. It's everything spiritual. Like, how did he leave this life? Did he leave in a good light? Did he leave in a bad light? That was so heavy on my heart and my spirit that I was just unconsolable. I had to call work and I had to tell my boss, and I didn't go to work after that. This was like I think a Thursday, but all of this went down, and I was to be a keynote speaker there on Friday, and there was just a lot of stuff going on, and I was just like, I was devastated. So I can't stay in my house because it's contaminated, and it's a place that's not like mentally healthy for me to like go to. So I'm staying with my mom and my dad, and for a couple of weeks, all I'm doing is like processing this and trying to do some spiritual work around it to try to get some, not necessarily fully calling on the church. And my friend was LDS, and by this time I had gotten back into the church. I hadn't had my priesthood blessings restored and all this other stuff, but I was devastated. And I talked to the bishop, and the bishop told me that my friend had come to him the day before he had actually committed suicide. He'd worked with him and he'd gotten all this stuff off his chest. And I just said, okay, it helps me understand some stuff. All I remember is like it was a couple of weeks, and then I got on my knees, and I'd just been pleading with God to know that my friend was okay. I mean, spiritually okay. I wake up one night, I'm in this massive, I don't know how to describe it. It felt like a hangar, but it was a mile. It felt like it was a mile by a mile wide and long. All I remember seeing is that there's this door in that dark space that I was in that opened, and it was like there's this radiance that I can't really describe. But all I remember is seeing my friend step into the doorway, and I ran to him as fast as I could. And as I almost got to him, and as I was getting ready to embrace him, he said this to me, and I'll never forget it. He's like, "Joe, what are you doing here? It's not your time. You shouldn't be here." All I wanted to know was that he was okay. He looked like he was 20 years younger. He looked like he was in his 20s. He was kind of like me. He was balding. His hair was back, and he looked happy. He looked healthy. That for me was the answer. I knew that he was okay. I remember waking up. I'm crying just even thinking about it. I roll off my bed and I tell God how thankful I am for his tender mercies, because that for me like just cleaned up so many things. A short time after that, I experienced some health problems. I had an operation to remove my gallbladder, but I came out of it and I'd gone into liver failure. And this is the second time. As an infant, when I was born, I already had some problems with that. But this time I go into liver failure, and I think some of it had to do with the amount of alcohol I drank about 10 years prior to this. It was all bad. I had to quit work. I was out of work for about three or 4 months. We didn't know if my liver was going to kick back in, and I thought I was going to die. And I had to start doing some preparations for end of life and like what that meant. It's really hard to talk to my son about it. It's even harder to talk to my parents about it. Everybody in my church ward, my church family, they were really awesome. Everybody in my family was awesome. And I didn't know what was going to happen, but I pulled out of it. My liver started working again, and I was just like, okay, maybe I got some more life in me. This is awesome. But at that point, I knew I couldn't actually continue staying at Cirque Lodge. The stress was just too much, and it was just an environment that just bred burnout. And I was burned out. I'd been burned out for quite a long time. Because of them carrying my insurance and helping me through that period, I committed to them that I'd stay with them for one more year. At that point, I left. I started doing drug and alcohol interventions. I would go into and meet families. I'd work with them to construct an intervention for their loved one. And then my job was to come in, run it, and then I'd get them to treatment. And I was successful at that every time. I never had anybody flat out tell me no other than one guy. And even when he told me no, he came back and we got him into treatment. So it worked out. It just took a little more time. An ex-coworker of mine from Cirque Lodge called me out of the blue on Valentine's Day and said, "Hey, I got my third DUI today. I think I'm probably going to have to go to prison. I don't know what to do." This is something I'd never done. So he asked me to come and meet he and his wife. obviously after Valentine's Day. I met with he and his wife, and I made a proposal to them that what I was going to do is I was going to coach him through the first year of recovery. And I said, look, if this is going to happen, I've got to get you into residential treatment. There is no if, or, and, buts about it. I've got to get that done. So where do you want to go? And he's like, well, the only place I want to go is Cirque Lodge. And I'm like, I don't know if that's even possible due to the nature of like the fact that we worked there and the fact that that's the second time you've like really been through that. And he said, no, it's the only place I want to go. And I said, okay, all right. And I was known as kind of a bulldog in what I did. So I started making phone calls. I started calling the clinical director. I started calling the operations director. I started talking to the experiential director, and I said, what's it going to take to get this guy back in? And like literally, I think I probably got at least 10 or 15 no's. The guy kept telling me, I'm not going anywhere but Cirque Lodge. And I'm like, okay. All of the executives committed to actually meeting this guy and like working it out. And I didn't think anything was going to happen. I thought they were going to tell him no, but he and his wife went in. They had a knockout, drag out like conversation about like, we've done this before. You toasted us, you roasted us. Basically, they had him come in. They got him up to the lodge and they took him through treatment. And then I took him through Steps Recovery Center where they did the IOP, and he got a job, and he was married, and he wasn't living at home. He was living on his own. He was riding a bike to go to work, and it took him, I think it was like 5 miles away. So he had to ride the bike all the way there. And then he had to ride the bike all the way to IOP and then back. And he did that for about 6 months, and he was not happy with it. When he got passes to go home, we would have knockout, drag out arguments. But what was really interesting, the judge in his case had a family member that had been killed by a drunk driver years before. And what I had promised him is I promised him that if he did everything I asked him to do, something miraculous was going to happen. I said, I'm not promising you're not going to do jail time. What I am going to tell you is that you will not experience the level of discomfort that you've had in your previous cases. And he's like, I'm sure I'm going to jail. I'm like, fine. You just keep that mindset. I just need you to do everything I'm asking you to do. And he did. And what he got was he got a fairly hefty fine. He got, I think it was three years of probation. And then he got a week of ankle monitor. The judge said this to him too. He's like, I've never done this in my entire career, but with everything that you've done and everything that has been accomplished and everything that you've got set to still accomplish, I've never seen anybody come in to the court system with that plan. We got him back home. He completed his probation a year and a half earlier than he'd been ordered to, and the court signed off on it. I've taken that plan and I've gotten several people out of fairly significant jail issues. In fact, the last person that I did it to is a sponsee of mine who was actually looking at federal charges, and the federal judge had never released anybody out on his own recognizance before, and actually said that on record. And he'd been a federal judge for like, I guess 23 years. And this is down in St. George. I told him about the guy I took him through, and I met this guy in treatment. I offered to be a sponsor to everybody that was in that treatment center. I was like a guest speaker, and I took him through, told him about the program and what it takes to get out of like their problems and what it takes to get into recovery. And these are things that I'd been taught while I was at Cirque Lodge. That then kind of springboarded itself into, I then got a job as a consultant to Steps Recovery Center. They had me come down to St. George, and I was to reform their curriculum because they were finding some struggles in kind of what they were teaching compared to really the product that they wanted, which was like people staying clean and sober. And I was called down there to do that. That didn't pan out. I worked with them for close to almost 7 or 8 months, but the owner sold the company. I turned my resignation in, and then I got another opportunity to go out to Mississippi to run a facility out there. And then my son called me out of the blue and said, Dad, I think I'm going to go to school at Dixie College. And I was like, okay. And by this time, my son had been dealing with some substance abuse issues, and I'd been really wanting to like get this kid into treatment for some time, but he's like me. He's like stubborn. He's not going to hear it, and he's definitely not going to let me help him. So I because I'm his dad, I have to kind of take a hands-off approach. But when he said he was going down to southern Utah, that was an answer to prayers. And this is all pre-COVID stuff. I applied for a job at this treatment facility called Lionsgate, just on the hopes that maybe something will transpire with my son and maybe it'll work out. But I was fine going to Mississippi too. That thing happened. I called the owner of the Mississippi place and I just said, I'm going to take this other position. So I started working there in Lionsgate in Parowan, and I started doing what I do. The staff there hadn't heard most of what I was bringing to them, and they were amazed because a lot of this stuff was like new to them, and this is stuff that I'd been doing for 15 years. I had an opportunity to really share the message of recovery, and it transformed a lot of the clients' perspectives about the program, about how to actually work it, how to implement it, how to stay sober. It just grew from there. I got to meet the staff members and disseminate what I knew to them, both in the IOP and the residential programs. The executives just really appreciated what I was doing, and I was still doing interventions, and I was bringing clients into them because of the fact that, from my perspective, there's too many addicts and alcoholics out there that are suffering that don't need to suffer. And if we can get everybody into treatment, there's a significant shot that they'll get it if they just do it a certain way. I've been taught that certain way. So COVID hit about, I don't know, probably 7 months into it. My brother got sick. My dad got sick. My mom got sick. And my dad lost strength in his legs. And then I had to leave work because I got a call from my sister. And my sister basically said, I can't do this alone. Everybody's sick and I need you here now. So I called the owner of Lionsgate and I said, I'm sorry, but I've got to go. And I don't know what this is going to look like related to coming back. I went up there and I had to get my sister from Missouri and her family out. But my dad passed and we had a very quick memorial. And then my mom goes in the hospital and I'm thinking I'm going to lose my mom. You know, I'm like sitting there going, wow, I wasn't prepared or ready really for this either. But I go back down to Parowan and I'm working, and mom calls me one day and says, I'm getting out of the hospital, but I need you closer. I can't have you that far away. I need you. I had to go into the executive's office and I talked to everybody, and I just told everybody, I said, I'm sorry. I want to still work down here. I love what I'm doing, but I can't stay down here. I've got to go back up. My mom's asked me to come up, and that's something that's sacred to me. So I come back up. I get a job closer to the parents' place, but it's in Brigham City. I worked there for about a year, and then that doesn't work out. And then I find myself back down here, and now I'm in private practice and still referring people to Lionsgate and doing that. And people at Circle Lodge are still asking me to come back monthly. That's currently kind of where things are at least in me and my story and where I'm at in life.
Obviously, there's lots of components there as I listened to you for the last 15 minutes or so. But when you got down on your knees and you said, if you take this away from me, I will take my life and turn it over to helping people overcome addictions. And that it happened. And I guess the thing is I cannot tell you how many times it doesn't work for other people. There's no answer to that. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know why for some people. I was reading a story about Slash, I think it was, from Guns N' Roses, and he just decided, I'm done with heroin.
Yeah.
Who does that? Yeah. Or anybody. I just use him as an example because I know my son has battled for 22 years and would love to get, be done with it for once. I mean, he's gone periods of time, but never been able to do it. And of course, we're always hopeful. But another thing that I was going to say is you obviously have had issues. You had your best friend pass. You had your father pass away from COVID. So these were issues that maybe in the past would cause you to go try to numb yourself. What is the way? How do you cope now when adversity happens? What have you changed in your life so that now that you're able to cope? Because even though you made that commitment to God, and there still has to have been times where you've been tempted, to drink.
Okay, so there's been one time, okay, and I don't know how to explain this to other people other than to tell you exactly what happened. Okay, my dad's only sister had a stroke and then had another stroke and then had another stroke, and we were expecting her to die. I get a call from my sister the day I'm thinking that my aunt is going to die. And this is what she says. She says, Mom's had a stroke. They're taking her to the hospital right now. And the only thing that registers in my head is like, you're talking about her aunt. You don't know. What are you saying? I literally am in an argument for 10 minutes with my sister on the phone about my mom's health condition and what's happened to her. And then it finally sinks into me. This is almost about a decade ago. It registers to me that my mom is now the one having a stroke. My aunt's going to die. Spiritually, the way it felt like to me, and this is something that I've actually gotten from Polynesians too, because both my sisters married Polynesians, and part of it is that they talk about how everything is done in threes. Well, I thought my aunt was going to go, my mom was going to go, and then there was going to be somebody else that I knew that too. And I lost it. I was completely devastated because I didn't have any control. The first thought that hit my head once everything registered is like, I'm going to go drink. I am absolutely going to go get just drunk. And I hadn't been in that condition for well over a decade. I mean, almost 15 years, I'd say at that point. So I immediately do two things. The first thing I do is I tell God exactly what I'm experiencing. And I argue with him, and I'm pissed. And I basically tell him I don't think it's fair that my aunt's going to go. I tell him it's definitely not fair that my mom is now having this experience. And I tell him that I don't feel capable of dealing with this by myself. And I say, I want to drink. And I tell him. And I'm basically having a conversation that I'd have to anybody if they were in a position that they had control and power over something like that. And at the end of it, I just reverted to one thing that I've learned in Alcoholics Anonymous. I just told God, I said, look, I know one way or another I'm going to be okay. I don't feel okay. I'm not okay with this, but I will only accept it along certain lines. And I said, the only way it's acceptable to me is if I just can find some acceptance in this. The only thing I have to go on is the only thing that I know to do, and that's to give my will to you. So your will, not mine, be done. And that's pretty much how I left it. That was painful for me because I didn't want to just turn it over, because that meant it's okay to take my mom, or maybe it's not okay to take my mom, but I was still wrestling with it. But at least I'd been honest enough with God to say, this is what's going on. And then I got on the phone with my sponsor and I said, I'm going to go drink. I'm going to go get drunk. He had known me in my professional state and like walking me through all of this. And then all of a sudden I'm calling him and I'm like, I'm going to get drunk no matter what. And he's like, what just happened? So I told him I got this news. I just prayed to God. I'm still a mess about this. I think my mom's going to die. I'm angry, frustrated, upset, and I have no control, and this is not okay. And he's like, well, what do you want me to do? I said, I want you to stay on the phone with me until I get to my dad's house to find out where things are at with him. I drive home. I get my dad situated. My dad's, this is just not common for my dad's just a wreck. And he's been like a cornerstone for me in my entire life, and he's just unconsolable. So I get him kind of organized and I get him resting. And I said, look, I'm going to have Sharon come over. I've got to go to the hospital and we're going to get you over the hospital. Okay. To know exactly what's going on here soon. So then I call my sponsor again and I said, okay, I've got to drive by the hospital, but in order to drive by the hospital, there's a really good route. It'll take me like another 4 or 5 blocks over here and I can get some alcohol, and he's like, okay, all right, stay on the phone. So he just stays on the phone until I get to the hospital. And once I get to the hospital, I said, I'm okay. I'm with my family. I don't think we're going to have to worry about this, but that's been the only experience I've ever had. And if I had not done those two things, I would have drank. I haven't had another experience like that because I prepared myself and I knew that my dad most likely was not going to make it once I found out everything that happened. I was talking to my sponsor. That's the one thing that I found out about AA is that you've got to have a support system and you got to tell them the truth. You got to work with them, and 24/7. You don't do anything by yourself. In that experience, I think it was an evolution of another part of the education and recovery that I needed to be able to experience, to share with other people. I've shared that experience that I've had hundreds of separate times to people and said, look, it works if you work it. You've just got to be willing to work it 24/7. Even if you don't want to, you've got to do something to get out of your own head. And I said, my experience is that it works, but it's not easy. And you've got to at least acknowledge that it's hard, it's difficult, and it's possible. So for me, I don't want this to sound like it's been an easy experience for me. It hasn't been an easy experience. I've had to move. I've had to change my life. I've had to recreate my life in a different area that I didn't necessarily want to. And I also had to create a support group where I had people that were a network of people that I could lean on that knew about the condition that I was in, and I didn't do it alone. And for me, it's saved my life. It's given me a career. It's given me meaning and purpose in my life. And you know what? That's enough for me today.
I think that's the takeaway for me, is that you had that support system there, that you were smart enough to know to call your sponsor and to listen to what they had to say. Because I know that for a lot of people, they go through the motions of getting a sponsor and saying that they'll do these things, but then when it comes down to it, they don't, and they don't call the sponsor. So I commend you for doing that. I also wanted to mention that you mentioned to me that there was a book, and it's called Living Fearless. I know that Jamie Winship was the author. So yeah, exactly. I know it's Living Fearless, but you can read the rest of it underneath there, because I don't have the whole title. It's a long one.
Okay, so it's called Living Fearless, Exchanging the Lives of the World for the Liberating Truth of God. Okay, now I got this book recommended to me in just the very end of November last year. Basically, the author is an ex-Washington, D.C. police officer. He's got some fantastic stories to tell, but basically, this book has revolutionized my relationship with God in a very unique way, and that what it's doing is it's making stumbling blocks that I used to naturally fall into not so significantly stumbling blocks anymore. And the basic key concept is that I believe in God, but I don't necessarily trust God. I'll just be completely honest. I struggle with the concept of trusting something that I haven't seen or measured to a degree to where I completely can turn everything over. It's excruciating work for me. But in this context, something's happened in the way that he presents it, where it's just as easy and as simple, because my relationship with God has not really been simple. It's been really chaotic, because I think a lot of it has to do with my upbringing and the church culture and belief system. Because I've still got the framework, of that, and I still struggle with it. Completely walking away from that structure has not been easy for me. The one thing in the book that's fascinating to me is it talks about this thing called confession and repentance and then transformation. And basically it goes like this. It's like confession is just telling the truth. And speaking honestly, it's like, do you trust God 100%? No, I don't. Tell him. And I do. And I tell him why. And I tell him the struggles that I have now. Completely just all my fear. I'm just giving it out to him. And then that starts the process of developing this synergistic process where it leads you into feeling and thinking differently, which will then create a transformation that creates a more harmonic relationship with God, where you start having more trust in what he says and what he does and in what you're doing, because things are shifting. This is where it gets kind of interesting for me. It's like the LDS church for me was very good at giving me a framework and a foundation. But there's things that I've had to learn through the process of my own self-destructive nature. It's to help me learn that there are other components that could have never been taught to me other than going through the school of hard knocks, my own alcoholism, my own experience with working with addicts and alcoholics, then actually transitioning into questioning everything about what do you believe, what don't you believe, having a greater relationship and reliance in prayer asking questions and then asking more questions and then asking more questions. And then this book is like reframed all of that for me and strengthened all of that for me. But it's helped me actually understand that this thing for addicts and alcoholics now for me, it's expanding my understanding of like what the message I need to share with addicts and alcoholics needs to be, and making it simplified instead of so complex. Because the Alcoholics Anonymous 12-step program, it's wonderful in so many different ways, and it gives us answers in so many different ways. But there's still roadblocks that people have to it. And this is just another manual I'm going to use to help break somebody's resistance down to the 12-step program to help them get clean and sober. And for me, I wanted to just make sure I had a moment to share that, because I think that message in that book is transformational to anybody that's dealt with any difficulty in life, and it's helped me.
Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead and put that in the show notes too. So when I put this together, I will list that book down there in the show notes. I'm also going to list the podcast, Do Your Dailies.
Yeah.
I know that's a podcast that you said that you enjoy, and I think that that's probably helpful for people too. So
the podcast, Do Your Dailies, is there's an executive at Circle Lodge that just got into retirement. My supervisor here at Hobble Creek, where I work, he's also a past Cirque employee that I basically mentored up through the ranks. And we're doing a podcast that's nothing other than a deep dive into the Alcoholics Anonymous Big Book and talking about the principles that are going to get people clean and sober. We're trying to be more like personal to it and more in-depth to just getting the message. We are breaking it down. We are talking about it. We are talking about definitions of words and what these mean and how to get a deeper understanding out of it than just going through and reading the book itself and saying that's enough. We are trying to personalize somebody's experience to the big book that's never maybe gotten into it or has some limited knowledge of it to get a deeper dive into it. So for me, that's another just extension of kind of what I'm committing myself and my life to, is to working with addicts and alcoholics and trying to get this message out to as many people as possible. And that podcast is just one step into another foray of things that I'm committed to doing.
Well, I think it's great that you knelt down that night and committed yourself to God that you would do these things. Whether people out there that are listening to this have a belief in God or whatever, it doesn't matter. It's what you believe. And for you, it has worked, and look at the good that you're doing. So, I mean, I commend you for that. I think it's wonderful. I know that there's a lot of people who have benefited from visiting and talking with you and listening to you. And hopefully there's some, I said it in the beginning of the podcast, I know that people will be affected in a positive way for listening to your message today. And there's no doubt. There's no doubt at all. I appreciate you sharing that. And before you go, I got to hear your experience with Hawaii or Hawaiian culture or Polynesian culture. I know you've got a couple sisters married to a couple Polynesians, you said, right?
Yeah. So my eldest sister is married to a Maori who actually grew up in Laie on Oahu.
Yep.
They've got huge family ties out there. And then my brother-in-law met my youngest sister while he was at BYU Hawaii. He's Tongan. The Laie area is very like significant in this, in that my time in Hawaii, when I went to Dixie College, a lot of the football players were Polynesians, and a lot of them were prior Laie residents that came over to play football for Dixie College when I was there, and I got really exposed to it. My time over in Hawaii was mostly spent with my sister and her family, and getting married there, going to school, graduating, and knowing some people that I went to college with, and surfing out there near North Shore and on Laie Beach, and going to PCC and all that other stuff. I've got a great affinity and great love for Hawaii. I've been out there also doing work for addicts and alcoholics, but primarily it's been family related. And I love Hawaii. It's awesome. I love the aloha spirit, and I've been very benefited by having both my brother-in-laws in my life, and to really have that spirit and that culture kind of part of my experience.
And that's where you learned about George Bikoso or Fiji.
Yeah, very much so, actually.
Yeah.
That music was such a part of like all of those young men that I got to know. It actually became kind of part of like my experience in the 90s. I love the island music.
Yes, we agree there. And I will tell you this, is the Polynesians that played football at Dixie when you were there, and you said they were from Laie, so there's a 99% chance they played high school football at Kahuku, which is the Kahuku Red Raiders. So a lot of big time football players have come out of that high school. It's just a hotbed for talent, and I've probably spent over a year of my life in Laie. So I mean, I know that area very well. Special place, there's no doubt about it. And when you talk about surfing and stuff, out there by Goat Island and that Hukilau Beach, that whole area, when my son Dusty passed away, we took his ashes. We actually spread them there at Hukilau Beach because that was a spot that he had enjoyed so much in his youth. So yeah, very special place. But I can, a lot of your story, and this is not unusual as I talk to people. Again, we haven't met before today. It's not unusual that by the time I hear someone's story, there's a lot of connections that I have with the individual, some more than others, certainly a lot, Joe, in your life. So I appreciate you sharing your story today. And, it's like I say, it's a powerful story. It's a story of someone who's had not an easy life, but someone who has taken the hard knocks, I guess, and made the most of them. And they're really helping a lot of people. And gosh, at the end of the day, whether you're a religious person or not, if you're going out of your way to help others, I think that says a lot about you as an individual.
Yeah. Yeah. So service, it'd benefit anybody. And service is such an integral part of kind of what I do, but it's also something that I invite everybody that I know to do. And Larry, I just want to personally thank you for this opportunity and give me an opportunity to share my story, and hopefully it'll benefit others.
Well, you are welcome. Thanks so much. All right, everyone. Hey, check back in 2 weeks. We'll have another interesting guest with another interesting story here on Nobody Knows Your Story. Aloha.
Down a little old country road not far away, let's talk story. It's where my mama was born, it's where I come from, it's where my daddy fell in love not long ago.
Let's talk story.
Let's talk story.
Let's talk story.
Sit down and relax, stay a little while. It's been so long since I've seen your smile. Well, a little of this and a little of that. Funny how time just slips away.
Cuz, we gonna talk story.
Eh? Let's talk story. Let's talk story. Let's talk story. Time for friends to share. Time to hear what's